a good prayer. I also want to thank MashaAllah Sheikh Ismail for always leading us in prayer and his beautiful recitation. Alhamdulillah subhanahu wa ta'ala has brought us to verse 87 of Surah al-Mā'idah and 88. And this is two verses that speak about the importance of eating halal and also avoiding what is haram. As after A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in translation, "You who believe, do not forbid good things God has made lawful to you. Do not exceed the limits. God does not love those who exceed limits. But eat the lawful and good things that Allah provides for you. Be mindful of God, Allah, in whom you believe." So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in these verses, as we know, this is a section in Surah al-Mā'idah that speaks about the relationship between Ahl al-Kitab, between the Christians and the Jews. And during the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, there was this idea of ruhbaniyah, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about in Surah al-Hadid, ruhbaniyatan ibtada'uha. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that this idea of monasticism is something that the Christian or the Jewish or the previous religious communities invented. Ibtada'uha. It was an innovation or a bid'ah in the religion. So originally there wasn't this idea that someone would go and they would isolate themselves within the community. They would go into the hills, they would stop eating particular foods, they would become celibate, they wouldn't marry, and they would not become part of the community. And as we know, during this time, there were Christians and Jews who were part of the community, but there were parts of them that would become monastic. And this was known in the Arabian time. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in these verses is speaking about this idea of ghulu fi d-din, the extreme in the religion. That there were certain people that they prohibited what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made lawful for them. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala yuridukum al-yusr. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants ease for all of us. وَلَا يُرِيدُكُمُ الْعُسْرَ. That He doesn't want difficulty. So what the previous religious communities, and we see this even today with some Muslims, is that they prohibit what is good. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made most everything halal and only a few things haram. But to prove their righteousness and to prove their piety, they say, "Oh, I'm going to make this haram upon myself." So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu, la tuharrimu at-tayyibat. Ma ahalla Allahu lakum wa la ta'tadu." Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, you who believe, that have iman in your hearts, those people who are mu'min, do not prohibit what is good. At-tayyibat. Ma ahalla Allahu lakum, subhanallah. Allah made it halal. So why are you making this haram? And many of the mufassirin here, they cite two hadiths of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. That he heard about this idea of some of the Muslims trying to prove their superiority, trying to prove their righteousness, prove that they're monastic. And one person, as we know in the famous hadith, he said, I'm going to fast every single day. And others said, I'm going to do all qiyam al-layl. And others said, I'm not going to marry ever. But then the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he heard this and he says, "Lakinni asumu wa aftir." He said, I fast, but then I also break my fast. That I don't impose upon myself a consistent hardship. That we as Muslims, we believe in Ramadan. Ramadan is a fard, but it's 1 month of the year. It's not that we are expected to do this every single day, and every single month. And we know that the sunnah is to fast Monday and Thursday, that there are days of the week that we are allowed to break our fast. And we know the fast of Dawood, that he used to fast one day and then break. And then I would encourage all of us to fast in these days of winter where the days are short and to make up our fast. And he says, وَأَصَلِّ وَأَنَامُ. He said, I pray and I sleep. That he doesn't do a qiyam al-layl all night. That he makes sure that he sleeps and his body has a right on him. وَأَنْكِحْ نِسَاءَ. And I marry women. He didn't say that to be a righteous person you have to become celibate and say, I'm not going to marry anyone, as we see with different religious leaders of the past. And he said, فَمَنْ أَخَذَ بِسُنَّتِي فَهُوَ مِنِّي. Whoever takes from my sunnah and my prophetic legacy is from me. It's part of the ummah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. وَمَنْ لَمْ يَخُذْ بِسُنَّتِي فَلَيْسَ مِنِّي. And whoever doesn't follow my sunnah is not among. So part of the sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam is to not become extreme in our deen. And the extreme in our deen is to say, because I want to prove that I'm righteous to everyone and become a model, that I'm going to fast all the time, or I'm going to do all the qiyam al-layl, and then I'm going to never marry. That part of our sunnah is that we follow the sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and that he knew that the body had a right. As in the second hadith, he says to his community, to his sahaba, "Inna li anfusikum haqqa." He said to your bodies and your souls, they have a right upon you. People sometimes neglect their body. When they're hungry, they don't eat. When they're tired, they don't sleep. When they have desire for marriage, then they put it off, they postpone it. But he says your body has a right upon you. وَإِنَّ لِأَعْيُنَكُمْ حَقًّا. And he said, and your eyes have a right upon you. That you should rest if you're tired. Don't force yourself. Don't pull all-nighters. This is not the sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He would sleep. He would do qaylula. He would sleep at night after Salat al-Isha. Sumu wa aftiru. He said, fast, but then also break your fast. When the sun sets, the sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is to immediately break your fast. Is not to postpone it and say, no, I'm going to be righteous. I'm going to break my fast at Isha time. That's not the sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He says, وَصَلُّوا وَنَامُوا. And he said, pray at night, pray Isha, wake up early, do qiyam al-layl, especially in the winter time. It's easier. But then also sleep, rest. فَلَيْسَ مِنَّا مَنْ تَرَكَ سُنَّتِي. And who said, the people who don't follow my sunnah, they're not among me. Now the Mufassirin, they find this last part of the verse important. وَلَا تَعْتَدُوا إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُحِبُّ الْمُعْتَدِينَ. So they contemplate, what does this mean, i'tida? Do not transgress. What is it that we could transgress here? So the Mufassirin say, what is this idea of exceeding limits? Is the idea of israf. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says here, don't prohibit the tayyibat. And in other verses, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَكُلُوا وَاشْرَبُوا وَلَا تُسْرِفُوا. Subhanallah, Allahu Akbar. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, eat, drink. So our religion is not just to starve ourselves and become ascetic. But it's to eat and drink. This is part of the deen. But when you do that, وَلَا تُسْرِفُوا. Don't engage in israf. Don't engage in excess and waste. That the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, even when you make wudu, and you're standing next to a river of plentiful water, you just take as much as you need. And this is essential because here in the United States, 30 to 40% of our food is wasted. Subhanallah. And I was researching almost every single year, every American wastes 250 pounds to 400 pounds of food. Subhanallah. And we see this even in our Muslim communities, that we do these big dinners and iftars. We're a community that loves food, mashallah. And a community that is very talented. We have cuisines from South Asia to the Middle East, to the Arab, to North Africa. Beautiful food. And mashallah, our community is very talented in this area. But when we make the food, then we make a commitment to finish it. And we make a commitment that if we're not going to eat it, that we're going to share it with others. And this is essential because when we eat the food, it's part of the barakah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is a blessing. That we know people in Gaza right now, for 2 months, they've been blockaded from food. They don't have this ni'mah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That there are trucks waiting, but they're sealed off. You cannot go. So they don't have this opportunity to eat. So some person here in the United States, as Muslims, as Americans, we eat the food and we think of other people. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, part of our sunnah, part of our deen, وَيُطْعِمُونَ الطَّعَامَ عَلَى حُبِّهِ مِسْكِينًا وَيَتِيمًا وَأَسِيرًا. That part of our deen is we do it'am. And it'am literally means we feed other people. We bring the food to them. We invite people to our homes. We welcome them. We think about the poor, the fuqara, the masakeen, the asir, the captive, the person in prison. We see that in Bangladesh and Syria. People missing for years. And then all of a sudden they emerge out of the prison, subhanAllah. That they were starved in those places. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَيُطْعِمُونَ الطَّعَامَ عَلَى حُبِّهِ مِسْكِينًا وَيَتِيمًا وَأَسِيرًا. That part of our deen is that we feed these people who are in need. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says here, وَلَا تَعْتَدُوا. Do not exceed the limits. Yes, Allah made this halal, but then don't overdo it. and start eating to the point that it hurts your health, that you start wasting food, that you're not concerned with your larger community. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at the end says, وَكُلُوا مِمَّا رَزَقْنَاكُمُ اللَّهُ حَلَالًا طَيِّبًا. Once again saying, eat. Don't starve yourself from what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave you a rizq. This is a bounty of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهِ. Be mindful of Allah. When you eat this food, don't just enjoy yourself. Remember that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave you this food, and that there are other people in this world that don't have that food. And that it's part of our responsibility to save our food and to distribute it to different communities. الَّذِي أَنْتُمْ بِهِ مُؤْمِنُونَ. If you're truly believers, if you truly have iman in your heart, then you would be conscious of what you consume. And you would be conscious of making sure that your community was well fed. And that when we go to sleep, we know that our neighbor is satiated, that they're not going to bed hungry, that they have enough to eat. So brothers and sisters, in conclusion, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us people who eat from what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us of rizq. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He has told us that monasticism is a bid'ah, is an innovation. That someone says because of their piety and they want to prove themselves, that they're not going to eat, that they're not going to sleep, that they're not going to marry. No, part of our deen is to follow the sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And he did all of those things. He married. He made sure to break his fast immediately. He slept during the night. And we see here the importance of eating halal. The halal tayyib. The Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, كُلُوا مِنَ الطَّيِّبَاتِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, eat. Do not deprive yourself. The part of our deen is to have a decent life, is to have a happy family, is to have a house, a car, a decent job. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is all praiseworthy thing. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا تَعْتَدُوا. Do not exceed the limits. Yes, these things are halal. Yes, these things are encouraged. But do not become among the musrifin, the people who waste, they exceed the limits, they don't care about what other people are thinking. That we should always have this idea in our mind, yes, my body has a right upon me, but so does that community, the community that I'm part of. And I encourage all of us to give locally, even to this community, that we have, mashallah, very good organizations here that serve food, that serve a meal. And we have Adam Center, mashallah, a kitchen. During the month of Ramadan, we have these brothers, amazing, and sisters that feed the local community. And also to give to our brothers and sisters wherever they are in the world that need food and support. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for forgiveness. وَالْعَصْرِ إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ